And my question I want to ask everybody that, of course, I'm not going to be able to hear your responses, but does anybody feel just completely lost right now, where you feel as though you have something figured out and then your district comes out with something and or your state comes out with something and it just feels like our world keeps getting turned upside down. I've had meetings almost every single day. I have a school board meeting tonight to determine what our back to school plan looks like. So my goal for today is really to talk through some of the issues, the concerns, but also some of the opportunities that we have during this time. And I'm going to do my very best to share my experiences, but also know that I am in a unique position and we are all in our own unique positions. So what works for me may not work for you. And so we have to kind of take it for what we can and use what we can. And so just real quick, just some information where you can social distance with me. I am on Twitter. I am on Instagram. I do have a website. And then the bottom link is I try to put out rather periodically just resources, things that I'm learning, books that I'm reading, all that kind of stuff. So if you want more spam in your in your inbox, go ahead and go there and you can sign up for a newsletter. All right, let's get into this. So I always like sharing a picture from childhood because that's kind of like keynote rule number one, right? Share some ridiculous picture from your fourth grade teacher. So this is me in fourth grade with Mrs. Arnie. And this was the entire fourth grade. We were just a real good looking bunch of kids there. And I share this picture because this is one of my earliest memories of a librarian in a library. And so those of you trying to guess, I am in the front row, right. I'm the only guy in the front row. And yes, there was some mullet going on, but we're not going to talk about that because that's not the point of this conversation. And I remember being in the fourth grade in Miss Arnie's class, among many things, but I remember Mrs. Poole. Mrs. Poole was my librarian, and it was my first memory of somebody putting a book in my hand. And there was two books I remember, and frankly, they're the only two books I remember reading through all of elementary. And the first one was the Red Wall series. And it's still a book that as a 39-year-old, I own every single one of those series in hardcover in my basement. My sons have no interest in them. I try to get kids to read them in the library, and it never works. And the second book was Hatchet, which I'll be honest, I have a much easier time getting kids to read that. But I often think about this, and as Mark kind of mentioned, I hear these stories of librarians who are, harping on kids about missed book, or late books, fines, all these kinds of things. And I wanted to be a librarian where I had the opposite problem, where kids were just dying to come to the library. And so as Mark, mentioned, I was in the classroom for 13 years as an English teacher and history teacher. And then I moved in the library last, 4 years ago. And any of you that are been in a classroom and moved into the library, I'm sure you had the same feeling as I did, is why did I not do this? Why did I not do this sooner? And so as we start moving forward, at least for me, when I moved into the library, I asked myself this question on a regular basis. Because for some of you, as I'm trying to, if you see me looking left, I'm looking at the chat so I can see these things. But, elementary librarians, they have a special, or in a lot of cases. So they have a class, a lot of them have curriculum. In the junior high, I sat there with my assistant many days and I just kind of looked at her and I said, what are we supposed to be doing today? Like, what are we supposed to do? We got to be doing more than just checking out books and sitting here, getting ready to take contacts out and put glasses in and buy a couple of cats. Like, this isn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to be more active. And this was the question I kept coming back to. And I bring it up today when we're talking about, being a librarian during a pandemic, because I would venture to believe, I'm going to make an assumption here, that a lot of you are asking yourself this question daily, hourly, maybe constantly. And if you're like me, and I'm going to be pretty honest about this, when our district went to the remote learning last spring in March, I was losing my mind trying to find stuff to do. We were not allowed in the building. We were not allowed to interact really with kids in any sort of physical sense, which I understand from the health standpoint. But we were trying to find things, ways to do our job remotely. And we didn't do it great. I will be the first to admit that. And I think my colleagues would as well. We did the best we could. And I think everybody did. We were in this crisis mode. And so moving forward, looking at this year, I recognize that as I'm looking through the chat here, some of you are probably going to be full in person. And you're really happy about that. You might be scared about that. Some of you are going to be in a hybrid situation. And that brings a whole unique set of challenges. And some of you might be like me, my district as of now, which may change, we are going full remote. And so what does that mean? What can we do? And I keep thinking this through, and I keep, the wheels keep spinning. And so as we go forward here, Shannon and Mark mentioned in reference to the Future Ready framework. And I've really built my thinking around pandemic librarianship around this framework. And so what I want to go through here, and some of you might be incredibly frustrated by the time we end here, because what I want to do is actually raise questions. These are questions I'm asking myself. These are questions I see librarians asking all over the world. But I'm hoping these questions might lead us to some answers. And I'm going to share some of the things that have worked for us. And we'll see, maybe something will work for you, at least that's my hope. So when we look at the Future Ready framework, the first big one that is probably my favorite is curriculum instruction and assessment. Is how can I teach kids? How can I be working with kids? And when we're in a quote unquote normal situation, this is easy for us, right? We're teachers. We work with kids. We get the VR out. We're doing 3D printing. We're building stuff in the hallways. The elementary folk are having their lovely little read alouds, their carpet time, and it's what we do. And the moment they take that away from us and tell us we have to go remote, it changes things. It makes things, very difficult for us. And it's not something that we were prepared for. You can throw me in a classroom and I can do anything. I can teach anybody anything within reason. Remote is a completely different scenario. And so when we think about our curriculum and our instruction, I have some questions that I want us to ask. And the first one is, and this is a tricky one, and I'm not going to get into the politics of this, because the first question is what protocols, are in place to make sure we're all safe, our students and our staff. And it depends again on your state. We're getting direction from Department of Health. We're getting direction. AASL, has put out recommendations. I saw Allison Mackey put out a great thing through ISTE Libs about ways in which to ensure safety within different zones within the library. And so my first question I always want to ask any librarian is, what are those protocols in place? We're trying to put in place in our building. We were putting in-person protocols, but that just went out the window about actually 3 days ago. So now we are trying to come up with protocols for, curbside. Our local libraries have been able to do this, and this is a service we want to be able to provide. But we want to have very, very clear protocols, because safety is always been a concern for librarians, certainly, but nowadays it's a totally different, we're in a totally different space. And the other thing we need to consider is how are you teaching? My elementary people that you're a special, I have seen all kinds of pretty unique scenarios, whether hybrid or remote, and really thinking about that. Are you going to be, team teaching with teachers? Last spring, I was very lucky. I had some very great ELA colleagues that I was able to jump in with. And do book talks and talk about, what they were reading, and having these kind of these moments where I can be a teacher in a Zoom setting. For those of you that are in the hybrid, are you going to be allowed to have kids come into your library space? In our district, they were pretty much telling us we weren't going to be able to have, groups in the library at all, and browsing wasn't going to happen. And so these are things that we have to, start thinking about, is what does that look like for you? And what does that look like for the learner? And the last one here is really important. I actually saw somebody in the comments, and this is probably a concern that I share. Maybe you guys have this concern, is creating a need for our services. And I know this sounds kind of silly, but we'll talk about budgets later on. But I'm very nervous nationally as we move towards this pandemic, remote situation that a lot of schools are finding themselves in, or may find themselves in the future. Is as we look to cut things, what starts getting cut? And I know I share with a couple of my colleagues this fear that they might look at us and say, well, maybe we don't need librarians. Maybe we can just put an assistant in there and they can manage these materials. And so I'm very cognizant of making it so that my teachers and my students look at me as somebody that they could not do their job without. When I'm in the building, I think I've done that pretty well. But this remote and this unusual kind of scenario we're in, I think it's even more important that we create that need. And so I spend a lot of time, as Mark said, I go running every day, and that is just something in the last several weeks and months that's always in my head. How can I create this environment that my principal is like, he would go to war for me to keep me in the building and keep that position. And that is definitely something that I'm very mindful of. And I think we all should be. So let's move on to professional learning, which is obviously different. Look at all of us right here, right now. Our professional learning is no longer, this is a picture of a few of my staff members. And this is one of my favorite things to do, is to bring new tools, new resources, new activities, and provide that professional learning for our staff. Most of it is around what are the kids doing? And I love getting them hands-on, even if in this particular picture, we're making, homemade kind of Lego-based drones and a teacher did cut their finger, but we're not going to dwell on that. So our professional learning has definitely changed. And so I like to think of, asking myself, what is my role within my building or my district? How am I going to be a provider of professional learning? And I think it goes back to that creating need, as everybody is going, all over the place, looking for resources, looking for ways in which to do this efficiently, effectively, and with integrity and with equity, all of those things in mind. What is your role in that? How can you bring something to the table and come to your principal and say, hey, here's a resource, here's something I want to bring to our staff that's going to help them. And then the second question is something that everyone's going to have to deal with, because I've seen schools that have gone full in person and they're doing their back to school professional learning all sitting, together. My own district shared a picture with our new teacher training, and they were in a giant cafeteria with masks on tables, good 10, 15 feet apart. Is that our reality? Is that what we're looking at? Is the days of the big conferences gone? And what does that mean for us and how we provide professional learning? If we can't go to those conferences, I was always a big fan of going to ISTE and then bringing back resources. Well, that's not going to happen. So, opportunities like this are, great. And thanks to Follow and Future Ready for putting it together, because I think it's a great opportunity. Dystopian future librarianship. I like that. So let's hang on to that. And we're talking about dystopian. Isn't this the point in life, in a dystopian novel, where some young teenage girl comes and saves us all? I think we're at that point. Maybe not. And then the last question I want to keep asking myself is, what is our staff's greatest needs? In the spring, it was all about figuring out Zoom, Google Hangouts, all of that kind of stuff. So when you think about your fall, what are you anticipating? And it's really about anticipating. What do you think your staff is going to need the most professional learning around? I would argue it's probably going to be, in my opinion, their greatest need is likely going to be wellness, mental health. And so as a librarian, what can we do, to provide that? But then as they get into that, space of comfort, how are we providing, professional learning around, teaching remotely, or teaching in a hybrid model, because even that has its own, challenges. So how can we be those resources? Robust infrastructure is probably not one of the more glamorous of the pieces of the pie on the Future Ready framework, but it's really important, and probably more important now than it maybe has ever been. Because we look at access, and do we have infrastructure within our buildings and without to provide support for both hybrid and remote settings. And I think about in my district, a lot of people think, well, if we just go one-to-one, that solves all of our equity and solves all of our access. And I hope we all realize that's not true. We are in a district of one-to-one, and we had kids that didn't have internet at home, or they don't have an adult that can help them get on and get to what they need. And my children, I have going into freshman year and going into 7th grade, and in their school district, they don't attend where I work, but they in the spring had a setting or a scenario where they tiered or kind of staggered the remote time or the online time for families, so that if you were in a family, maybe you only had one device, but you had kids at different levels, you were actually able to access that, and you weren't having kids needing to be on at the same time. And so these are things we have to think about. Does our infrastructure support that? And then what resources are available? So what are you providing at home? Do you have an e-library set up for our students, for our families? Are you providing, what do we have? Do we have hotspots we're sending home? And so I think it's really interesting how our infrastructure can support this, because we're going to need it, folks. We're going to be sitting in this situation for some time now. And this is one I don't like talking about right now, budget and resources, because like you all, maybe you're in a great position and money is just flowing out. I'm concerned that our budgets are going to be slashed considerably. and we are going to be asked to be doing more with less. And I also understand that we are very lucky, we are very fortunate to have jobs, and I think about that a lot. I think about a lot of the folks in my community that have lost their jobs. I'm still working, I'm still getting a paycheck. And so I try to keep that in perspective. And if cutting my budget allows us to keep, a teacher on staff, then cut it, and I will make do. And Trish, what budget? Yeah, I'm sorry, I hear that. And so we're going to have to be able to make, do more with less. And there are resources out there. So the first question we have is, how are you going to reallocate and reduce spending, based on these smaller budgets? And one of the questions I'm asking myself is, as we're moving full remote in the fall, we use Overdrive with the Sora, the app. And so our initial thought is, all right, we need to push a lot of our budgets into online books or ebooks. And then I worry about, okay, if we push everything there, next year, let's say we get back to school, now I've missed a year of adding new content, new books, new resources to the physical library. And so trying to find that balance for me is important. And so I have bias. I will be freely admitting to you, I prefer hand books. Our circulation of print books is very high. Our circulation of ebooks is pretty low. I think it's probably because we're in the one-to-one environment and kids just need some time away from a device. And so if we can do the curbside, I'm going to be a very happy person if that's something we can do. And for those of you that say, what budget? I don't have a budget. I would really advocate that you look into grants. My library, if you were to come in, we have a laser cutter. We have 3D printers. They're not in my library. They're currently in my basement. But those were acquired through grants. And that is something I actively seek out, because this is something that I know I'm not going to be able to support financially every single thing. And then the last question is, when you talk about your resources, how are you going to manage that? If you guys are all like me, oh man, the spring was a hot mess. We had, my building has about just shy of 800 kids. And at the end of the year, we had, like 1,400 items that were out, whether we're talking textbooks, extended text, library books. And so to try to get all of those resources back, we're still missing quite a bit, as you can imagine. And so pushing out these materials in the fall, we have, just all kinds of things to think about how we're going to manage our resources. And a couple people have asked about grants. In my own community, we have a education foundation in the community that supports grants. I know there are, just a quick Google search, there are grants through Lowe's, because I look for a lot of makerspace type of things. But yeah, I would look around, and if anybody has grants that they've used that are more national, mine are obviously more local, please put them in the chat for folks that are looking over there. Data and privacy is our next one. Also one that sometimes we don't like talking about, but I think we need to, and certainly one that I take pretty seriously for a number of reasons. And the first question I want to ask is, and something we need to be considering is, how are you going to ensure student privacy when you're in the remote settings? And if you're in person, I think we figure that out. We don't videotape kids and post it without their permission. We know what our district's policy is on sharing on social media. But I think when we're in the Wild West of remote learning, we got to be careful. And I will say that I'm seeing districts that are requiring students to have their cameras on when they're in Zoom or Google Hangouts or Meets. And to me, I believe that's a violation of a student's privacy. And I will go around with people about that. They think, well, we need to make sure the kids are checked in. And I just think about myself as a young boy. I would not have felt comfortable with my camera on in my house. And we have students who live in situations they don't want their classmates to see. Not to mention, if my own child is on a camera with 30 other students, who else is in those houses looking at my child, seeing what they're doing? It's a totally different situation. And every context and every community is unique, and I respect that, but I think we need to really be cognizant of student privacy. There are other ways for students to check in with you if you're teaching a class. And so I would really put that in the back of our minds as we're thinking through what remote could look like for some of us. I'm seeing a question about what about teacher protections? And I'm not sure what you mean by that. I think what you're asking is, what about my content being out there, my face being out there. And that is another thing to consider. I've seen districts that have said, you don't have to have your face out there, and they support you in that. I will tell you, my own children, they're required to be on a synchronous remote schedule every single day during their class periods they would normally be in class. And I have a feeling there may be some potential conflict there because I don't support that. But that's just me. And then the second question is, I'm not trying to be rude, I'm just reading through here, is we have to be careful when we're talking about privacy, is when we are in this state of, constantly trying to come up with solutions, which is what teachers do. We got to be careful when we start pulling in all these free resources and apps and things as to what information is being, collected on our students. Illinois has recently really overhauled their student privacy acts and laws. So be very aware of what you're using and what your district is supporting. And that, again, is very contextual, because in my district, we have Canvas as our learning management system. So our teachers have a house to put all their things in, and some districts don't. So they're, I get it. As teachers, you're trying to find what works, what's out there, what's free, because we're on limited budgets. But just be very mindful of the resources you're using and how you're using it. And not to mention copyright, which I didn't mention copyright, as I saw in the chat, because I think that's one of those things that as librarians, no matter what situation and what setting we're in, copyright is part of what we do and part of who we are. Okay, so just to clarify, protections for teachers against students who might record them. Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't know if there's a way around that. And that's great if somebody has comments in there about, and we know that kids are going to take screenshots of us and post it. We know these things happen, and to a certain extent, there's only so much we can do. And this is going to seem like a really, really bad answer. I feel as though I'm in a position with 99% of my students that they have a positive relationship with me, that they wouldn't do that to me. And I feel that way. And I know that's a really, really crummy answer, but I think it's that we have those conversations, we have those norms, but also have those relationships with kids. Mark and I are good friends, as I mentioned, so I'm not going to post some silly picture of him on the internet. Although I do have some good videos of us launching, astronauts at space camp, but we'll talk about that another time. So the next piece of the Future Ready, framework is the community partnerships. And this has become really, really interesting as we move into this pandemic that we're in. Before we could reach out to, partners, have speakers come in, work with local companies, and that has totally shifted. And one of the partnerships that I was able to create very early on was a guy that I, went to high school with, and he had a company called Carbide 3D, and I created kind of a partnership with him. It's a CNC milling machine, and really it was just, he wanted to see what it could do in a makerspace environment. So him and I worked on trying to get these things. So just, you never know who you're going to connect with. And then the picture on the left, I just wanted to talk real briefly about this, because what we're seeing is, libraries and makerspaces really stepping up during, the spring when COVID really hit. Our hospitals were short on PPE. And I made a partnership with our local hospital, and several of the tech STEM-based people in our district were doing this. And we were 3D printing face shields. So those are face bands, and we had clear plastic covers, and I cut a lot of elastic, I'll tell you that. We made several thousands of these to send to local hospitals. And so we formed that partnership, and they have me on speed dial. When they need more, they just send me a text and I whip up some more, and we send them down. And that would have been something my kids would have definitely been working on, but they were obviously remote. But one of the cool things was I had a random email. Somebody I didn't know was from a 5th grade student in the district, but I didn't know the child. They were at a different school. And the mom just sent me an email and said, "Hey, I just want to let you know we followed on Instagram, your face shields. My kid got excited about it. He has a 3D printer he got for Christmas. And he started making little bands that hold the back of the ears, the elastic off the ears. And he was printing these and donating them to the local health centers. And I just thought that was kind of cool that we're seeing kids step up and have those partnerships. So when we think about the community partnerships, one big partnership we got to think about is our local libraries. How are we going to use them as a way to provide additional resource as an additional resource for students and for families. In addition to libraries, but also your local bookstores. We have, anybody in our area knows about Anderson's bookstores, and they are just a fantastic partner with our district, but certainly with our community. And so how can you use them? How can you use them to get, and I'll talk a little bit later about our library and what we do, but we push out content from our local library because it's, again, just another resource for families. And then just stop and think, because everybody's community is different. What do you have in your community that you can be using? And not only what the community can do for you, but what can you do for the community? And that is kind of what we were talking about with the, providing the PPE for the local hospitals. So just, again, thinking through, this is an unprecedented time, which is a word I feel like I hear 1,000 times a day, and I get sick of the word, but it's true. And so we got to be pretty creative and pretty innovative and think, outside of the box. All right, so collaborative leadership. And this is interesting because I spend a fair amount of time talking to teachers, talking to librarians, and the way in which we are viewed and valued in buildings varies greatly. I know in some places librarians have very little, quote unquote, clout, very little opportunities for leadership. And in other places, they are sitting at the table with the admin making decisions. I am very lucky that I am in that category. My principal supports everything I do. He will regularly call me and ask me for my opinion on things. So when we think about leadership, it is my opinion that librarians need to be involved in grade level, department, and building level decisions. Whether it's just curricular decisions, that's probably the most important decision making we should be a part of, to make sure that our collections are supporting the curriculum. But beyond that, our spaces, how we can support, I still remember talking with our math team, our 8th grade math team a couple of years ago, because as a librarian for the first couple of years, everybody just looked at me as the guy who just played with toys all day, because we were flying drones, we were doing, Sphero obstacle courses. And I remember working with our 8th grade math team to create activities where we had, spheros, and we were coding linear equations. And so being a part of these conversations, so again, it goes back to the whole showing value, but showing that you should be a part of that leadership within your building and certainly within your district. And as we look at, moving kids remotely or hybrid, a big piece of that puzzle is the resources. And that is the textbooks, the materials that kids need for their learning. And we are the critical part of that. And so when we are having these conversations about schools opening, not opening, how they're looking, or how does that look, librarians need to be at that table now more than ever. And I firmly believe that. And it's important. It's very, very important. And this one, I will tell you, is tough to talk about right now, because I absolutely love my library space. And my wife will tell you, the last 4 years, I love going to work. I always loved going to work as a teacher, but being in my library, being in our libraries, I don't think it's mine. Being in our library is my favorite thing. Having kids come in and build towers, making a mess in the maker space, doing green screen, I love being there. And so not being there is really, really tough. And it kills me. And so whether you're going to be in person, what are you going to do? And so one of the things, and we talk about our spaces have changed. I look at the picture on the right, this is my son. And just those of you that have athletes might relate to this. When everything shut down, they were doing Zoom training sessions. So my sons are goalkeepers. And so they are doing goalkeeper training and going through on little whiteboards, talking about scenarios. And this has become their reality to a certain extent. And then on the left is a website I created with my assistant, and that's our space right now. And within that, we have activities, we have virtual field trips, we have all of those kinds of things built into there, because we were in a 100% virtual space last spring. I'm hopeful. If you ask me in a few hours, several hours, tonight's our board meeting, and they might tell me I still am not going to be able to come into school. They might tell me I might be able to be in there and have small groups. I might be able to be in there and just do curbside. I don't know yet what that's going to look like. And as every good librarian knows, we're going to adapt, and we're going to do what we need to do for the kids and for our staff. but our space and our time they're all over the place right now. And depending on your situation, who knows what it's going to be. But the virtual space is so critical right now. And so the question is, obviously, how will your space be used? Whether you're in hybrid or remote. And some of you might be in full back to school, quote unquote, normal scenario. And what does that look like? Are you being asked to, wipe down tables? Are you being asked to hold materials for 72 hours, 4 days, 5 days, depending on which, Department of Health recommendation you read? They're all over the place right now. Are you going to be allowed to have kids browse in your space? Are you going to be going into classrooms? How are kids returning materials? Like all these questions, if you're in the building in any space. And then remote, what virtual space are you going to keep? Are you going to have your own unique space, or are you going to be partnering in with other specials if you're in the elementary? Are you going to partner with an ELA or a science department if you're in the junior high or high school? What does that look like? And what are those digital spaces you're going to use and create? And I want to be very careful about this, because it's not just about the kids, because what we're also finding is families need a lot of support as well. And this could be something that is, as librarians, we can step in and be another resource for them. And this is very important. And I'm seeing a comment here from Mickey. I'm going to call you out here. You say collaboration is very difficult. And I will tell you, this is more difficult in a remote setting than in person. And as a librarian, I had to work very hard to get buy-in and get collaboration from my staff. The ELA department was easy because the librarian has always been, really part of the ELA department. So that was no problem. And so how was I able to show value to the history department? How was I showed to the math and the science to say, hey, I am somebody that you want to collaborate with? And I mentioned the math department, but my social studies, bringing them in and doing virtual reality. I even send emails out saying I've created all these online remote field trips to align with what you're studying. So really showing them that value helps bring that conversation together and collaborate. And I know it's easier said than done, because some people are just mean and not easy to work with, and that's a reality, but you got to keep trying, because that's what we do. And literacy is the big one. And I could talk for hours and hours and hours about literacy, because I often get haters. Is that the right word? I don't even know. Maybe that's the right word. Of people saying, Josh, I watch your Instagram. All you're doing is, making t-shirts and flying drones, all this kind of stuff. Do kids even read books in your library anymore? And I'll tell you, our circulation, I went from 16,000 titles was the size of my library. And we're down to right around 7. So we cut that many out of the library, and our circulation has gone significantly up. And it's because we had stuff the kids weren't reading. We started replacing it with more contemporary, more current pieces of literature that kids wanted to read. And so literacy is so important. And there's really just always 2 questions that I always ask when we talk about books. And when you're in the pandemic, obviously this is going to be, the first question is going to be very creative depending on your situation. Is how will you get books into kids' hands? That is my favorite thing to do, is to give a book to a kid. No, that center picture was not 3D printed. That was cut on a woodcutter. And my wife will tell you it took very, very many hours, and she was not a fan of it because the cutter was at home that summer. But we'll talk about that later. But how are we getting books into kids' hands? Are we checking them out? Are we wiping them down? All of these things. Because I believe in getting a kid a book. And it may be in the virtual, it may be an ebook, and that's fine. And the second question is so important to me, and this is where I get pushback and I get people to get upset with me, is what are the books? What books will you get into kids' hands? And if you think about our curriculum in the ELA world, or you look at the history books our kids are reading, they're predominantly white authors from a predominantly colonial or white perspective. And that is not something that some people want to admit. It's a tough conversation. I think in the wake of George Floyd's death and what's going on in our country, I think the conversation has become more urgent. Not to say that it wasn't there before. I don't want to say that. But I am more cognizant of making sure there are books in my students' hands that not only reaffirm what they believe, but also challenge what they believe. And I always like talking about books, and I just, real quickly here, because I'm running out of time, but I just like sharing a couple of books here that I always like to talk about. And Sherman Alexie's The Absolute True Diary of a Part-Time Indian is probably, and we can have a conversation till we all get blue in the face around whether we should be sharing Alexie Sherman's books. If you're not sure why I'm saying that, you can Google him and find that out pretty quick. But this is a book, the language in it and the way in which it connects with our young junior high boy population is second to no book in my library. And The American Born Chinese is a fantastic book that I always recommend, and more so now than ever, as we see some pretty clear language and attitudes towards Chinese Americans and people from China. And I think it's very important for kids to understand perspective. And I feel bad for any student that's going back to school and will face that sort of hate. Maybe he just likes you as a book that I believe every single person in the world should read, by Barbara D. I am making both of my sons read it. It is a story about consent. It is a story about the way boys and girls should interact and the way we should be, giving and receiving consent before doing anything. Dear Martin, blows you away. And then the sequel coming out, and it's about racial injustice in our country. And it is definitely powerful. And The Mighty Heart of Sunny St. James is a same-sex relationship story about a young girl. And we have a lot of young kids that do not feel safe to be who they are at home. And they come to school and sometimes they don't have that as well. And so I am not. I am a white male. And if you notice that through the camera, I have a wife, I am straight. And so there are conversations I can't have with students. And so books like these allow me to have that avenue to jump in there. And then For Black Girls Like Me is a fantastic story. And I connect to it personally because I have two brothers who look exactly like me, but are really better at growing beards. But I also have a younger sister who is Black. She was adopted. She's been with me since she was born. My parents did foster care. And this story is about a young girl who's adopted by a young Black girl who's adopted by a white family. And they live in Baltimore, but then they move out west to a town of really no minorities. And so just listening to her story brought a lot to me, but also, really gives that perspective. And I'm seeing some great book recommendations in the chat here. Yes, The Hate You Give. I mean, there's so many good books that really challenge our thinking around the world. In my personal opinion, politics aside, the greatest problem our country has right now is a lack of perspective. We as people do not have a perspective or empathy for other people and other ways of life. So if I can put a book in a kid's hand to make them feel better about themselves, or maybe challenge their thinking a little bit, then I'm going to do that. So, all right, we'll get off that soapbox. In the center of the future library, framework, it says learner-centered, and I always come back to this, and I see if kids don't want to be in your library, then what are we doing? And I always think that if kids don't want to be in our libraries, what are we doing? And it can be because they know they're going to come in and have a safe space. They know they're going to come in and have time to read quietly. They know they're going to come in and, like one of my favorite students, Audrey, her and her two pals, they were working on a project, soldering iron. Yes, she did smolder a little bit of her hair one day, but that was okay. And when kids ask to come to the library, and I say they can't because there's a meeting or a class or something, they get upset. I feel like I'm doing my job right. And I guess I should note, somebody mentioned Stamped by Jason Reynolds. I read that this summer and it changed my life. So I'll leave that at that. And so this all comes down to, we look at all these different pieces of the Future Ready framework, and it comes down to, what do you do all day? What is your day going to look like this coming year? It's probably going to be like, it's not probably, it is 100% sure that your year is going to look unlike any other fall that you've ever had. I actually feel somewhat envious of first-year teachers or first-year librarians because they won't know any different. And so this is a question, some of you may already be back to school. Some of you might be working towards it in the next couple of weeks. And I just keep coming back to this question: is what am I going to do all day? And I do, and I'm not just saying this, but the Future Ready framework does allow me to look at all those pieces. And because it allows me to compartmentalize what I have to do and what I can do. And I think there's a tremendous amount of value in it. I'm like 2 minutes early. So again, if you want to connect, I'm looking at some of you tweeting. Thanks for pushing the content out. I do have a book out. I just share that because, that's what you're supposed to do when you do one of these things. It's a picture book, so it's very easy to read. But I say this from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for being here. We're almost 700 people spending, their morning just learning. And I know that we'll get through this. We will do everything we can to support our kids and support our staff. And I truly wish all of you the absolute best of luck this coming year. And hopefully some of you will jump over into our breakouts and have some more conversations around the work that we're doing as librarians. So I thank you very much for your time this morning.